quite a bit of time talking about carbon tax as preferable to cap and trade, about the structure of that, noting, for example, that the British Columbia carbon tax is now frozen at $30 and they're refusing to raise it. So we're going to need federal leadership in the federal provincial talks. We're going to have to maybe start with $30 as a floor, but raise it by $10 a year to an adequate level to really do something about emissions. And like the other group that reported, we also agreed that the tax should be at the wellhead and on imports. And talked about investing in green energy, and that it's hopeful that more investments in the electricity sector is going into renewables and then into fossil fuels, but we have to do that across all energy sectors, not just electricity. Stop the subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, leave 80% of the fossil fuels in the ground to be compatible with 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. And the corollary of that, of course, is to stop building pipelines. Yes. When Canada counts its GHG emissions, we have to look at not just the ones that are emitted inside our borders, but also the ones that are emitted by the products we export.
Yes.
We noted Policy Horizons Canada report, this obscure government agency I'd never heard of before, saying that within 10 years, the fossil fuel economy will be uneconomic. So why don't we act that way? We need to facilitate interprovincial trade in green energy without resorting to nuclear. We need to support clean tech entrepreneurs. Yes. This means support not only financing, but also government procurement so that these new ideas will get off the ground. There's a role there for the private sector. Government has to do more in education. And we noted that the targets that we saw in the initial slides, they're still the target of the Harper government. And even though Minister McKenna had said that it was a floor, we haven't had new targets announced yet by the current government. And the Harper target is not adequate for 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. And the other part of the Harper plan that we need to revise is one that a lot of people don't know much about. And that was the intent to buy a lot of our greenhouse gas reduction overseas by purchasing offsets. And we submit this is a very dangerous idea because the carbon market globally is full of fraud, it's full of double counting, and it's full of grave human rights violations. If we want to support Indigenous people, we can't be stealing their land and murdering them for the sake of carbon offsets.
Yes, sir.
Well, we're going to spend less on war and armaments and more on the transition to green energy. And circling back to the local situation, we've got to procure more of our food locally. Community gardens like the one Sister Gwen has next door, and not importing our food long distance.
Thank you. At the last table again. And then after your table, we'll skip over.
Okay, so there's been so much gone over that is very important, so I might be reiterating some things. I might be reiterating some things, but they're all important. So our group was very positive, and so that was really nice. So one of the notions that we really need to make clear is false is that the economy and the environment are anything but the same. We have to know that anything affecting one affects the other. So when you say that the oil sector, the oil industry and the private sector needs to kind of take some band-aids and to keep us going is not the right attitude. We have to recognize that environmental effects are the same thing as economic effects. So once we start realizing that all our focus on the oil industry is detrimental to the money that flows through our country and goes to other countries, then we can start pushing for the right direction in that respect. So we talked about the realism of the target of 1.5 degrees and how a lot of people detract from that, saying it's not realistic, we can't get there in such a short time, when the real point is that it's more unrealistic to set a target for 2 or 3 degrees, because that results in catastrophe. And unrealism, and that kind of unrealistic thinking is just kind of gonna get us in a bad situation.
Can I interrupt you for a
Yes.
second? Ironically, I have to interrupt you about a car. There is a car that I believe is going to be towed or something. It needs to be moved anyway.
It's parked in one of our tenants' parking spots. There's 2 disabled spots.
Okay. So it is a Chevrolet Cruze beige, plate ACDR 751. Okay, I'm sorry. It needs to be moved. I'm sorry to block you, but just, we'll go right back to you.
It's an echo.
I was, no comment about the car, I just.
See, they cause a lot of problems, don't they? And then our group was looking at certain issues, and one of the ones that came up a lot was Indigenous peoples being on the vanguard of this issue, of this entire thing. They are the most affected. They are on the front lines. They are always taking the brunt force of these disasters and of the lack of aid that should be given to them. And so I'm going to reiterate something that's been said, I think, at least twice, implicating the UN Declaration on Indigenous Communities and the rights of Indigenous communities. This would at least be one key to giving them the rights they need and the aid they need to start retrofitting their communities, to start facing against the problems that we've all kind of given to them. So yeah, involving Indigenous communities as some of the most important. One other thing is education. I am a student right now, and from the inside, I see a lot of the systems in education have no inkling of a connection to these issues. These issues affect everyone in every aspect of society. So reformation in our education systems and in our curriculums should be put in. So things like preschool, we should be giving mandatory gardening classes, like how to grow food, how to raise awareness for environmental issues, and not just in the primary school system and the TDSB, but into the privatized more and more universities. Because Toronto specifically and Canada has been a leading country for education and has so many great aspects to its education system. But one thing we need to start teaching to everyone is how to help in this new world. People need to know. I go to OCAD, which is an art school, and we seem to be, you think art students are more like, activists and aware, but it's not true. So many people don't know anything. And we need to make it mandatory. We shouldn't be always teaching ancient history and teaching how to build your green roof or how to design the next fuel-efficient vehicle. So, education is one of the most important things that we need to try and reform. Then again, many things that just need to be reiterated. Keeping the money of these private sectors like oil and gas out of politics. We need electoral reform so that we can start putting the people's voice first, and just considering the future in the government. We need to convince the government and make them understand that we are out of time. Thank you.
My notes are a little bit skimpy, but I had a lot of ideas. You guys are really smart. Our group was fully in favor of carbon pricing, but we were all pretty suspicious of cap and trade. for some of the reasons you've mentioned, and it doesn't seem to be working too well anywhere in the world. So we would prefer not to see it here in Canada. We want something that's effective. I personally, and a few people at our table, are very much in favor of a revenue neutral carbon fee and dividend, where you price the fossil fuels at the source of entry into the economy, take all that money, it's in a separate pool, you divide it up amongst Canadians, and you give it back to us, so we make the choices on what the money's spent on. So that gives a market signal to businesses to go greener, to develop more green products. Carbon intensive products will be more expensive. Green products will be cheaper. We'll all be better off. When you get the money back, the number crunchers say that more than half of us will get more money back in our pockets than we spend on the increased prices, because those of us at the lower end of the economic scale have smaller carbon footprints, so we don't spend all the money on carbon intensive goods anyway. The people that are sort of carbon hogs will spend more money, although their prices will increase more than the money they get back, so that will, we hope, incentivize them to go greener as well. Businesses like this, because you put a fee on to start, and then you have a predictably rising price, and they can plan according to the rising prices. The third thing that you need is border adjustments so that Canadian businesses remain competitive. We talked a lot about electoral reform was needed so that we could get influential dollars out of politics, because it seems that the people that are in favor of fossil fuels happen to also be the people with lots of money, and they've had their way for a little bit too long. And proportional representation was kind of favored there, but that's really only the start of electoral reform.
We are going to be having a town hall on electoral reform. We just don't have a date yet.
And another town hall is coming up on proportional representation, on electoral reform, sorry. We were all very suspicious of the TPP, especially the dispute resolution mechanisms. We need to be able to protect the health of our own people, plants, animals, and environment. One person thought that ecocide could be considered a crime against humanity, which it is. And it's also an intergenerational harm against humanity, so there's really no excuse. So we were also totally anti-fracking, totally and along with most of you, totally against increasing any extraction of fossil fuels, so therefore no pipelines, no increase in fossil fuel infrastructure. We wanted real ways to hold people and corporations to account for the harm that they do to the environment, and I've heard people before of people saying that they should have to have a fund ahead of time for any sort of harm that they do that is not held by them, because corporations have a habit of making away with those funds and going bankrupt and leaving big messes behind for everybody else to clean up. We were talking about a cultural shift, and I think a corporate cultural shift is important also, that there needs not to be just a financial bottom line. Everyone expects that's always their excuse. We have to do what's the best for the finances of the shareholders, but they also have to do what's best for the economy and best for social justice. And it's just ridiculous to kill people and to kill the environment because they're making more money for somebody. We recognize that Canada is a small country, but we do have outsized impact on our GHG emissions, And unless we get that under control, we have no moral authority to ask the bigger players to get their emissions under control.
Thank you. All right, so we have to, excellent. And so that's the table there, and then you guys are next. Thank you.
I'd ask everyone in the room to give yourselves a round of applause for coming out to this on a Friday night. Awesome. Now, in the interest of time, you don't have to clap through the rest of everything I say. So on that note, so I'd actually like to start saying that in my undergrad, I was able to go to rural Indonesia to do research. It was comparable, stop that. And it was comparable to Canada in the sense that it was a country where the oil palm industry, a different industry, wrecked huge amounts of rainforest and is putting huge amounts of carbon in the ground. And I did research in a rural community that was indigenous to the area, where the best way to stop oil palm and its relentless expansion was indigenous rights, specifically free, prior, and informed consent. And they weren't fighting for an Indonesian definition, they were fighting for the UN's definition, which is what we should apply in Canada and not accept a weaker definition. And it's also comparable because the palm oil industry is very similar to the fossil fuel industry, as we all know. They lobby relentlessly to stop the government from implementing policies they know we need and that they know most people would accept because they're the right thing to do. So on that note, we had very broad consensus at our table that the fossil fuel industry, also known as Brad Wall, had to be challenged in ways that included ending fossil fuel subsidies, no pipelines, a moratorium on new fossil fuel development, and that if we accept the science, we have to accept the implications. And that means accepting the reality of a 1.5 degree and a 1.5 carbon budget, which means funding public education so that people, the general population, so people who don't come to this because they might not be savvy about climate change, understand why policies are being taken and support them. We need a Brexit from austerity, which is making it impossible for the government to take the action, again, that we know is necessary. If people are poor or worried about their jobs and have insecurity, they're not going to support taxes. They're not going to support changing society. So having policies that get us there by not making people vulnerable and feel afraid for themselves. So that we're able to accept climate refugees, as we know is going to be necessary when sea levels rise by meters in our lifetimes. And this means, thank you. Okay. You can clap for accepting refugees, that is perfectly acceptable. And funding public transit. This is the riding that is hopefully going to have a downtown relief line. And that means that the government is going to have to support it. And it's an easy way to get people out of their cars and to reduce emissions. And shout out to no TPP, which seems to be a common theme today. And on a final note, can everyone in this room who thinks we should keep fossil fuels in the ground stand up? Can everyone who supports 100% renewable energy remain standing? And if you think that free, prior, and informed consent remains a veto, congratulate yourself.
So we have one last table. Thank you.
All right, can everybody hear me? Yeah? All right. One of the things that shaped our discussion was that we see this as a real, Canada has a real opportunity right now. We mentioned earlier the majority government. There's also the Ministry of Climate Change and the Environment has taken a really strong stand. We made a real impact in Paris. Now is the time for follow through. It's a small window where we can become really a world leader in changing so much of our policy and really making this happen. It's a big promise. We can do this. We felt this. We felt optimism about it. One of the things that we thought would be a really clever way to affect change is we talked about how Calgary is a center. I was just there myself. It's drawn so many brilliant engineers and finance experts. There's a real center of excellence there. We need to find ways for the government to empower this group of very gifted people to just change direction and focus all of that expertise on new technologies. So venture capital, it's not just workers on the ground, it's really, really high functioning professionals. So let's incent them. We also talked about, I'm jumping around a bit, but we also talked about changing the building code to new buildings are going up that aren't as sustainable as they can be. Every building should be LEED. That should actually be the baseline for new buildings. Another idea was to subsidize and incent urban tree planting. It's a great way to not just make the city beautiful, but also to really suck up a lot of this carbon that we're spewing everywhere. Incenting people to drive smaller cars. Oh, also lots of excitement at our table about the electrification of the GO transit, right? And hoping that that can go through. It hasn't happened yet for sure.
Metrolink.
So yes.
So we want that to happen for real because there is a plan like
Can
over
you hear
the
that?
years, yeah.
Yeah. So we want to make sure that that actually happens. It's a multi-year plan. Oh, yeah, the more car-free thoroughfares in the city. There's a King Street plan afoot to so that you can catch a streetcar every 2 minutes. One of the things that we talked about was, sure, it's free transit around the city would be great, right? But we also understood at our table that it's not